Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Corda.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Corda. Joining me today is Pat Palumbo and Father Jack Lavelle, and we're going to talk about stewardship. It's nice to have you both on the show today.
It's nice to be here.
Great to be here, Father.
Let's begin by defining stewardship, first of all, and let's trace those roots first back to the Bible.
Well, I think we need look no further than the very beginning of the Bible to discover this sense of stewardship that God has put forth. I think of it every Easter Vigil when the very first reading that is proclaimed is that story of creation, and we hear the account of all that God creates. But then once he creates Adam, he gives Adam this charge to be a steward of all that he has created. So it's really one of the earliest concepts from God, one of the earliest concepts of our society, is to embrace what has been given to us, but to see that we're not owners of it. God is the owner, but he entrusts it to us, whatever it is, and we are called then to be stewards, good caretakers of all that he has given us. So we see it from the very beginning of Scripture, and then that really does develop throughout the Old Testament. And I would say that that concept then is carried through not just in God's creation of plants and animals and the environment, but then we see it carried through in family life and caring for children and then caring for other members of our families. We really see it come to a great understanding in the New Testament, in the Christian scriptures, when we get to Christ's own teachings of how we are continually stewards.
Let's then move centuries ahead and talk about how the church has developed stewardship and what exactly does the church teach about stewardship?
Father Corda, the church today primarily bases a lot of the teachings on stewardship on the pastoral letter on stewardship that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops put out about 20 years ago. And it's still very valid today, and it keeps getting reprinted, I might add. But in that document, they talked about the importance for us to be steward disciples. And they defined discipleship as following Jesus Christ, regardless of the cost. So following the path of Jesus. Stewardship is a practical way for one to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And in their pastoral letter, they talk about some various points. For example, the first they talk about is gratitude. That a steward disciple is grateful, as Father Lavelle just said, for all that they've been given in God's creation, everything that they have, and recognizing that all comes from God, that we really own nothing. Even that cell phone that you have came from raw materials from our earth that were given to us by our loving Creator. So everything comes from God, and we should demonstrate gratitude for what we received. Likewise, we should be responsible for the gifts entrusted to us by God, as was Adam, again, as Father pointed out in Genesis. And then we should also be willing to share those gifts with others and to make sacrifices in our sharing with others. As a parent, we know what it means to sacrifice and give up what you want to do for your loved ones and your family members and your children. But likewise, we should do that for other members of the community and for God also, and God's church, Christ's church. We should be willing to make sacrifices for our church and share our giftedness with others.
Let's go back to that whole sense of everything is a gift. You know, how difficult is that for people to really comprehend? For example, parents, to understand that their very children are gifts from God. You know, they're not something to be kept and held on to, but they're to be grateful for and sent to mature and to grow and so forth. How important is that to understand that everything is gift?
Well, I think it's essential that that be the movement. But as you kind of mentioned in the question, it's not happening. in our society. And it's not just in how parents respond to this control of their children. We see it in every segment of society. We own things, we possess things, we must have things. And we don't have that really well-developed sense of everything we have is a blessing and a gift from God. I had another priest friend who really worked very hard at understanding that. And when people would come up to him and say, "Oh, Father, your grass needs cut," he'd say, "It's not my grass, it's God's grass. Now, what are we going to do about working to cut God's grass?" And he really challenged himself. Now, I'll admit it's very difficult for me to even keep that concept, but it's a concept that we really have to continue to drive home. It really is this fight between good, responsible stewardship and this malformed sense of ownership of everything.
And then obviously we talk about stewardship as a way of life. And isn't discipleship a way of life? Is that interchangeable?
I think it is interchangeable, yes. Again, to be committed to following the path of Jesus Christ is certainly a way of life, and a very difficult one. And just to piggyback on what Father Lavelle said, I think in our American economy and in our American culture, it is most difficult to be a disciple and to be a good steward, because the number one trait in American culture, as pointed out by many demographers today, is individualism. And to be an individual and stand up for yourself and represent yourself is an important thing in our American culture. But unfortunately, that's pushed to the extreme where people believe they own everything and it's all about them. And we have iPods. We have everything sort of individualized, as opposed to being a disciple of Jesus Christ and being a steward. We're taught to be grateful for what we have and to share everything.
And of course, oftentimes the misnomer is that stewardship is equated with giving money. And stewardship is obviously more than that. We're down to 2 minutes of our first segment together. Let's talk about why stewardship is more than just giving your money.
Well, I was thinking when Pat was talking about this individualism, and it is so contrary to the story we hear about the early apostles post-resurrection. We hear that beautiful story about this community that held everything in common, and no one was lacking. And I think that's true. As we've moved from that to individualism, and there are still people then who are lacking because that community is not together, we see it as, I'll throw a few shekels in their direction. But it's not just about the money. It's about making sure that all of us as one family have everything we need. In some cases, that becomes a financial sense of charity. But it should be in our care, our concern, our love, our affection. We really need to be stewards of all-embracing characteristics.
And when we talk about everybody, we're not talking just about Catholics, but we're talking about everybody within humankind and the body of Christ.
Exactly.
Correct.
Again, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, we open ourselves up to all of God's creation, all people.
We're going to talk more about that, but we're going to take a quick break. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Johnsons enjoy Friday dinners out. Nothing fancy, just time together to reconnect as family. They make sure others eat as well. By giving to Catholic Charities of Youngstown, the Johnsons join other angels who care for those in need, regardless of religion or race. Show your wings with a gift to Catholic Charities, changing lives one family at a time, providing housing, emergency financial assistance, senior services, and more. Give now at ccdoy.org.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her. Instead of sitting on the couch, I hope to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say thinking of her and the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm talking with Father Lavelle and Pat Palumbo on stewardship. Why is it important for us to have that concept of a communal aspect of stewardship as opposed to this individualistic approach to what I would call Christianity? You know, some people say it's me and Jesus, but it's really we and Jesus. And how is that expressed in stewardship, in particular in how we share the gifts that God has given us?
Well, I think first there needs to be that recognition of our gifts. But then once we have that recognition, I do think, as you mentioned, we need to understand that we are called to share ourselves with our brothers and sisters. And that needs to be seen in the broadest sense. And you're right, we tend to start to narrow it in its definition. I think many people would be under the misconception that we as Catholics should only take care of other Catholics. And we see this even in canon law. The pastor of a parish is responsible for all the souls in his territory, not just the Catholics that come to his church, but all of the people. And so the beautiful gift of our church is, in terms of our parish boundaries and then our diocesan boundaries, we are there for all of God's creatures. There isn't one spot on the map of this globe that isn't taken care of or that we aren't responsible for as brothers and sisters. And so we even see it in the work of charity. People will say, well, you know, do they only take care of Catholics? We use the maxim that we give and we help not because they are Catholic, because we are Catholic. We're motivated to then reach out. And I would say the vast majority of our clients, perhaps at Catholic Charities, aren't Catholic. But we are still called by God to care for all our brothers and sisters in need. So it really needs to be always in the broadest definition, rather than trying to narrow it down.
And I know that there are certain identities that really depict what a steward is. And I would see those as threefold, as someone who gives their time, their talent, and their treasure. Talk briefly, Pat, about all three of those.
Well, you know, we've been given so many, we have 24 hours in a day, we have 7 days a week, and really we challenge people to remember their faith and remember God once a week. We'd say attend Mass at least on a weekly basis. And many find that difficult, and that's somewhat of a challenge also. But how do we share our time? We have so much time in a given day in which we're awake and up and about that we can't stop and take a couple of 10-minute segments in prayer, again demonstrating gratitude to God for the gifts we have, or praying for a loved one, or praying for our neighbors and friends, or those who are struggling. So how we use our time really is something to consider as a steward, and where do we spend our time? When I talk to young people about stewardship of time, I ask them how often they go visit a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or another relative, or even a neighbor, again, not necessarily in the immediate family, a neighbor whom they know is homebound or is ill. Do you take a little bit of time from your play or from whatever you're doing and maybe go and talk to this person for 10 or 15 minutes? Share your time. Be willing to share this gift of time. Likewise with talent. The challenge I see with talent is that many people really don't name their gifts, Father. They don't acknowledge, well, I'm not good at anything. I don't have gifts. But when I heard a speaker, Bishop Robert Murnau, who's one of the writers of the Pastoral on Stewardship, speak, he challenged people by saying, when do you feel most alive? When do you feel most excited? What are you doing at that moment when you feel, boy, I'm in the zone. I feel really good right now. I'm empowered by this activity. That is probably when you're demonstrating something of your own talent or your own giftedness. So we should be able to name our gifts and then be able to share those gifts with others.
And then stewardship, you know, oftentimes when people think of stewardship in treasure, they might confuse it with tithing. Is it the same or is it different?
Well, tithing certainly is a biblical concept, and it is implored in many, I would say, outside the Catholic circles. But tithing is not just this strict 10%, and it's not just what you give to church. I think it is more a broader sense of recognizing how you've been blessed, and how you might be able to financially use those gifts. Kind of piggybacking on what Pat mentioned, and you asked about the time, the talent, and the treasure. Why I think those threefold are so important is you could have all of one, and it's not going to get you anywhere. You know, we could have all the money in the world, but if we don't then take the time to use those funds and to put them into active ministry, what good is that? And people could have all the talent in the world, but if they don't take the time to use it, and if certain resources aren't used to advance those talents, where does it get us? And of course, you can have all the time in the world, but if you don't have the resources, what can you do with it? So I think the threefold, as you mentioned at the beginning, they have to be interwoven. But again, back to that financial, it's not just strictly, I gave this money. But I think too often people in our current society, even though we see problems with the economy and finances, I think going back to other things with the time, I've talked with people and they'd rather just write a check for $10 and be done with it. And is that really good stewardship? You know, to invest yourself into the process. I mention with people sometimes now with caller ID, they look at it and they go, oh God, I don't have time for her. You know, and we don't give of ourselves. And we really need to weave all of that together if we really are going to embody what a true steward is.
Which brings me to my next question, and we only have 2 minutes in this middle segment. How important is consistency on behalf of a disciple in response to stewardship? For example, I can't pick and choose which teachings of the church I want to follow. As a follower of Jesus in the Catholic Church, I have particular teachings that I need to follow. Or I can't just pick this or that. How important is it to be consistent as a steward? Does that make sense to talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that consistency is so important. And going back to where we began, talking about Scripture, you know, we hear that beautiful story of the sower and the seed. And one of the examples is it doesn't take any root, and it springs up right away, and the sun scorches it and it burns it out. And that's always told to us. It's equated to those people who just lunge on to some activity for a brief while, and they're going to do everything, and they're going to be this, and they're going to be that, and I'm going to help with this, and I'm going to sign up for this, and then they're gone. And where does that get us? And so I do think that consistent development of who we are called to be. And kind of going back to the pastoral, even before the pastoral in the United States, I would say a lot of our Catholic social teaching that began back in the late 1800s with Leo XIII, it was consistently built upon and consistently developed by every Holy Father to our current Pope Francis. And so we see that consistency and that always developing and that always building upon it is so essential. We can't just grab on to the latest fad. You know, stewardship cannot become a fad in someone's life until the next thing to occupy their time comes along. It really has to become, as we said, that way of life. Breathing is consistent. If you stop breathing, if you're not consistent in breathing, you will die. And so if we're not consistent in how we breathe our stewardship, breathe our discipleship, then it will just wither and die.
We're going to talk more about that in a moment. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Their numbers are growing, more and more. More than a year ago, more than a decade ago. More people now living in this state than nearly any state in the Union. 1 out of every 8 people in America. 1 out of every 10 families in America. 1 out of every 6 children in America. 33 million Americans struggling just to remain standing. 33 million Americans teetering on the brink of hunger, sickness, hardship, uncertainty. 33 million Americans in these United States descending into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. We're talking about stewardship as a way of life. Pat, I'd like to ask about the whole concept of volunteerism. Is it appropriate to talk about people volunteering their time and their talent for not only their church, but also for social organizations or outreach activities. How important is volunteerism as a model for stewardship?
I think it's very important, Father Corda. Again, you're sharing your time and you're sharing your talents with others and making an impact in one way or another. And, you know, we have so many empowering stewards among us. And, you know, we talk about stewardship and whatever, but so many people, I believe, live a stewardship way of life, but don't acknowledge that that's what they're doing. They just do that. And many people are involved with community organizations, sporting organizations, or whatever. I have friends who coach Little League teams and baseball teams and things of that nature, and are empowering young people to be all they could be with their giftedness. And then at the same time, they might be involved in their local church, be it Catholic or non-Catholic and whatever. But I think volunteerism is definitely part of stewardship of time and talent.
One thing with volunteering, though, and I always think back to the priest I was referencing before. He used to say he really didn't like the word volunteer because of the connotation people were putting on it themselves. That a volunteer, in their definition, is someone who can do what they want when they want and then stop whenever they want. And so he liked to refer to his volunteers as unpaid employees. Because when you're an employee, you have responsibilities. And I think that goes back to Pat mentioned, you know, with gratitude, and that also comes responsibility in our stewardship. And I think, again, in our society, we need to continually capture that concept of responsibility, of being consistent, and not just jumping into something and then dropping it. So I think yes, volunteer. I don't think that word is going to come out of fashion, but I think we always need to be clarifying the definition, that a real volunteer is someone who is committed and sticks with something.
And Pat, you had alluded to something about sometimes as disciples of Jesus, some people wear that on their sleeves. Others do it in more quiet, kind of unknown ways, but yet significant ways. Is there a difference, or are both acceptable?
Well, I would say to the degree to which you go to one extreme or another is whether it's acceptable or not. But I do know a lot of people who do a lot and say the right hand doesn't have to know what the left hand is doing, and they feel they want to keep their stewardship of time, talent, or material resources somewhat private to themselves. You know, when we go through the Lenten season, and Jesus tells his disciples to keep your hands cleaned and wash your face and stay kept when you're fasting, so as not to flaunt it. And he chastises those that do. Well, there's that side of it too, you know, wanting to be in that corner. But then again, I think there are many people who deserve recognition for their outstanding stewardship. You know, in our own church, we see so many who have made such generous donations to some of our parishes and to some of our endowment funds at the diocese and things like that, and have a name attached to it. And I think they serve as models of stewardship. And I think there's a positive thing to say about that also.
Let's talk about Jesus as the model for the steward. What do we find and see in him that we need to emulate on a daily basis?
Well, I think the greatest model that he gave is that he came not to live for himself, but to live for others. That's why he was incarnated, that's why he was born, that's why he suffered and died and rose. It was all for others. So I think in the whole aspect of his coming into being in history, in time, while he was with us, was this showing us, this modeling for us, how we live for others. And again, going back to some of the things that Pat was mentioning, I think the motives are always there. Whether someone is very quiet or whether someone is more known in their stewardship, whether it's their time, their talent, or treasure, what are the motives behind it? And I think they always have to be pure motives of caring for others, caring for our brothers and sisters. And again, we see that modeled so well in Jesus. It was always about himself, or not about himself. It was always about allowing himself to shine through others. And that's what we as disciples then need to become.
Well, obviously his quote, he came not to be served, but to serve. And that's ultimately the mandate for a disciple of Jesus. We're down to the last 3 minutes of our show now. I'd like to talk in a different light about the stewardship of vocation. How important is that in the life of a Christian? First of all, that this is a vocation that I have to be a steward, and how important to put it in that context is that whole concept.
Well, I think when people first hear the word vocation, they're going to think we're talking about whether it's a priest or a religious. But you're right, we are all called to a vocation. And we're called to different vocations throughout our lives. But I think you're right, we need to see it as a vocation. This is a way of life. You know, if you're a priest and you talk about, oh, I had to get up today and do this and do that, you might find someone will say, well, that's not your job, that's your vocation. And I'm very quick to point out to people, you're right. Now, what's your vocation? You know, that vocation really is what we are called to be, not just what we are called to do. And so all of us, by virtue of our baptism, are called to be a steward. It's our vocation. Now, whether that takes the form of really being involved in overt charity, or whether that takes the form of being more behind the scenes, whether that takes the form of going out and just sharing our time, and others' talent and others' treasure have been the underpinning for that. It can take all different forms, as long as we all recognize that each and every one of us has been called to a vocation, and that vocation is one of a steward.
Pat, just one final thought on stewardship.
Well, following up on Father Lavelle's comments about vocation, we do have in our diocese a diocesan stewardship commission, and Father Lavelle and I both are on that commission. And the priests and lay leaders of that commission see it as our role, as our vocation, calling others to recognize stewardship as a way of life. And we have annual gatherings, etc. We'll bring in national speakers and whatever to promote stewardship as a way of life. And I think it's important for people to know that at their local parish there are resources available that the Commission has put out, such as we have a toolkit for building parish communities that has different tools, welcoming tools, affirming tools, stewardship prayers, gathering space ideas, stewardship of treasures suggestions. One major component of stewardship is accountability. We're all called to be accountable for the gifts entrusted to us by a loving God. And so we have samples in there of how a parish or how one in their personal life could be accountable. So we make these available to people. Hopefully they'll follow the call to be steward disciples.
Well, Pat Palumbo, Father Lavelle, thank you so much for being with us and enlightening us on the whole concept of stewardship as a way of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Corda.
Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy.